On December 19th, 2025, Earth becomes a lab rat in an experiment we didn't sign up for. 3I Atlas, an interstellar comet venting hydrogen cyanide and methanol at unprecedented rates, will wrap our planet in its tail for approximately 6 hours. Unlike Halley's harmless flyby in 1910, this isn't water vapor and dust. This is reactive chemistry at planetary scale. We're talking potential neon green skies, red-shifted sunlight killing crops, and trace poisons settling into groundwater for decades. Could this encounter be accidental, natural, or are we witnessing something far more intentional? Stay with me until the end, because what we uncover tonight will challenge everything you thought you knew about comets, chemistry, and whether we're truly alone. The countdown has already begun. If you're as captivated by these questions as I am, go ahead and like this video and subscribe so you stay locked in as December 19th approaches and the data comes flooding in. Leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, what your local time is right now, and what you think about this new shocking possibility. Part 1. December 19th, the day the sky changes. You wake up on December 19th, 2025 and the sky looks wrong. Not storm wrong, not eclipse wrong, wrong in a way that has no precedent in recorded human history. The sun rises, but the light filtering through the atmosphere carries a tint you've never seen before. By nightfall, the stars are drowning in a glow that shouldn't exist. This isn't science fiction. This is the day Earth passes through the tail of 3I Atlas, and every atmospheric scientist who's been quietly running the numbers is holding their breath. Let me tell you why this matters. On December 19th, Earth's orbital position places us directly in the debris stream of an interstellar comet that has already travelled farther than any object we've tracked in modern astronomy. The geometry is precise and unforgiving. At approximately 14 hours universal time, our planet will intersect the densest portion of 3I Atlas's tail at a solar elongation angle of 73 degrees. The comet reached perihelion on November 2nd, and since then, it's been venting material at a rate that makes every other comet we've studied look like a leaky faucet. The tail stretches across 40 million kilometers of space, and we're going to fly right through it at 30 kilometers per second. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Everyone remembers the Halley's Comet panic of 1910, when newspapers declared Earth would pass through the tail and we'd all suffocate from cyanide gas. Spoiler alert, we didn't. That tail was mostly water vapor, with trace amounts of carbon and nitrogen compounds, diffuse enough that it posed zero threat to anyone. But 3I Atlas is not Halley's Comet, not even close. Recent spectroscopic measurements from the Atacama Large Millimeter Array show something that makes astronomers go very quiet when you ask them about it. The dominant emission isn't water, it's hydrogen cyanide and methanol, in concentrations that dwarf anything we've measured in cometary tails before. The numbers are genuinely strange. ALMA detected HCN rotational line strengths at levels 3 to 4 times higher than standard comet models predict. But here's what keeps me up at night. The methanol fall-off doesn't follow normal behaviour. In a typical comet, methanol production decreases with distance from the nucleus following a predictable curve, usually something like r to the -3. 3I Atlas shows r to the -5.2. That steep fall-off suggests something nobody expected, dense pockets of material rather than a smoothly dispersed cloud. We're not talking about a gentle mist of molecules spread across millions of kilometres. We're potentially talking about concentrated knots of chemistry, regions where the molecular density could be orders of magnitude higher than the surrounding tail. So what happens when those molecules hit Earth's atmosphere? That's the critical unknown that separates interesting astronomical event to, oh god, we need to talk about this. The question comes down to mass loading versus injection altitude. If the molecules burn up in the thermosphere, between 80 and 600 kilometers altitude, they'll create a spectacular light show and absolutely nothing else. The thermosphere is hot, tenuous, and anything entering there gets shredded by ultraviolet radiation and atomic oxygen. But if enough material survives lower, if molecules make it into the stratosphere between 15 and 50 kilometers up, the chemistry gets complicated. That's where the air is dense enough for sustained reactions but still above the weather layer, where rain would scrub everything out. Now let's talk about the observational anomalies, because this is where 3I Atlas stops being just another comet and becomes genuinely puzzling. Multiple observation runs show jet collimation patterns that don't quite fit standard sublimation models. Jets are common in comets, They're caused by localized heating and outgassing. But the jets from 3I Atlas show non-radial outflow vectors. Instead of spraying material evenly in all directions from the sun-facing side, some jets appear to be vectoring material at angles that require either very specific rotation states or, and I want to be careful here, something we don't fully understand about how this object is venting. Natural explanations still work, but they require the comet to be rotating in just the right way with vents in just the right configuration. Possible? Absolutely. Common? Not particularly. Here's what the mainstream agencies are saying about all this. Nothing. Well, not nothing exactly, but close enough. NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office issued standard low-risk boilerplate language. The European Space Agency's Near-Earth Object Coordination Centre lists 3I Atlas as Category 0, no predicted threat. There are no coordinated atmospheric monitoring directives, no emergency sampling missions, no high-altitude research aircraft being scrambled to collect data during the encounter. The silence is either extremely reassuring or extremely concerning, depending on whether you think institutional science is being appropriately cautious or dangerously complacent. The trajectory uncertainty window has been shrinking as we get more observations, but there's still wiggle room. Small variations in how dust and gas interact with solar radiation pressure could shift when and where Earth intersects the densest regions of the tail. We might hit the core of the debris stream at 1400 hours, or we might hit it 6 hours earlier or later. That timing matters because it determines which hemisphere experiences peak exposure during darkness versus daylight, and atmospheric chemistry behaves very differently depending on solar illumination. The media has latched onto the term cyanide tail because it sounds appropriately terrifying. Let's be precise about what that means. Hydrogen cyanide is real, it's in the tail. ALMA measured it directly through rotational spectroscopy at specific frequencies that only HCN produces. But calling it a cyanide tail, like it's a cloud of gaseous death, is oversimplification to the point of inaccuracy. HCN molecules in space are not the same as HCN gas in a sealed room. Context matters. Concentration matters. What happens when those molecules interact with Earth's atmospheric chemistry matters more than the scary name. So what do we actually know as December 19th approaches? We know the tail composition is anomalous. We know Earth will pass through it. We know the timing and geometry. What we don't know is what happens next, because this scenario has never occurred before in the history of atmospheric science. We're about to run an experiment that involves the entire planet's atmosphere and 7 billion people. No lab setup, no controlled variables, just Earth hurtling through space at 30 kilometers per second, about to slam into a chemically reactive debris field that stretches farther than the distance from Earth to Mars. And here's the question nobody can answer with certainty. What happens when those molecules hit our upper atmosphere at hypersonic speeds? Do they burn off harmlessly, or do they trigger something we've never seen before? Because if the chemistry works the way some models suggest it might, we're not just talking about a pretty light show. We're talking about the sky itself changing colour in ways that could cascade through every ecosystem on Earth. We know what's in the tail, but what happens when these molecules slam into Earth's upper atmosphere at 30 kilometers per second? Part 2. The chemistry that could ignite a sky. Let's talk about how to accidentally set the sky on fire. Not with flames, obviously. The atmosphere doesn't burn like wood. But there's another kind of ignition, a chemical cascade that could turn Earth's upper atmosphere into something resembling a planetary-scale glow stick. And the worst part, the chemistry is real. It's just a question of whether we're going to hit the right conditions on December 19th. The reaction chain starts simple enough. You take methanol, add hydrogen cyanide, throw in atomic oxygen which exists naturally at high altitudes, and expose the whole mixture to intense ultraviolet radiation from the sun. Under the right conditions, these molecules don't just float around peacefully, they start reacting. Methanol breaks down under UV into formaldehyde and methyl radicals. Hydrogen cyanide reacts with atomic oxygen to produce excited states of molecular oxygen, and here's where it gets interesting. Those excited oxygen molecules, specifically the singlet oxygen states, emit light at 557.7 nanometers. That's the wavelength of the classic green line you see in aurora displays, the exact colour of a neon green glow stick. This process is not theoretical. Airglow happens naturally every night. Right now, above your head, there's a faint layer of greenish light at about 90 to 100 kilometers altitude, caused by exactly this chemistry. It's dim, about 1,000 times fainter than the full moon, but it's there. Satellites can see it. Astronauts photograph it. The question isn't whether this chemistry exists. The question is whether we can massively enhance it by dumping exotic molecules into the reaction zone. Let's run the numbers. Natural airglow produces about 1 megawatt of power across the entire planet at 557 nanometers. That's enough to be visible from space, but barely noticeable from the ground. To create a glow bright enough to disrupt ecosystems, you'd need to boost that by at least 2 orders of magnitude. That means injecting enough HCN and methanol to increase the excited oxygen production rate by a factor of 100 or more. Based on standard photochemical models, you'd need column densities of around 10 to the 15th molecules per square centimeter for hydrogen cyanide and similar numbers for methanol. That's a lot of molecules. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If 3I Atlas dumps its densest pockets of material into Earth's thermosphere during peak outgassing, those numbers might not be impossible. The photolysis timescales tell us how long these molecules survive once they're in the atmosphere. Hydrogen cyanide at thermospheric altitudes, exposed to full solar UV, has a lifetime of about 10 to 30 seconds before it photodissociates. Methanol lasts maybe 2 to 5 minutes depending on altitude. These are not long-lived chemicals. They hit the atmosphere, react violently with whatever's around and disappear. But during those seconds or minutes they can trigger cascades. Each HCN molecule that breaks apart releases a hydrogen atom and a CN radical. CN radicals are incredibly reactive. They'll grab oxygen, attack ozone, and create secondary radicals that propagate through the atmospheric chemistry like dominoes falling. Now let's talk energy budgets. If we assume that 10% of the HCN in the tail actually makes it into the reaction zone, and that 1% of those molecules successfully create excited oxygen states, and that the tail dumps a total of 10 to the 14th kilograms of material during Earth's pass, you can calculate the total chemiluminescent power. The math is straightforward. Energy per photon times the number of photons. The answer comes out to something like 50 to 200 megawatts globally. That's 50 times brighter than natural airglow. Still not daylight bright, but enough to be visible to the naked eye as a distinct green tint to the night sky. But there's a feedback loop nobody talks about. Methanol interacts with ozone in ways that could amplify the reaction. The stratosphere contains a lot of ozone, and ozone absorbs UV, radiation that would otherwise break down methanol, so if methanol makes it down to the stratosphere, it survives longer than it would higher up, and surviving longer means more time to react. More reactions mean more radicals mean more excited oxygen. More excited oxygen means more glow. It's a self-reinforcing cycle that could, under the absolute worst conditions, produce sustained airglow enhancement for hours or even days after the initial encounter. Could HCN actually reach the troposphere, the weather layer where we live and breathe? Almost certainly not. The failure modes are numerous and robust. First, destructive photolysis tears apart 99% of HCN molecules before they get below 50 kilometers. Second, even if some molecules survive, they'd need to diffuse through the stratosphere without reacting with anything, which is chemically implausible. Third, tropospheric rain and cloud chemistry would scrub out any trace amounts that somehow made it through. The atmospheric barriers protecting the surface are multiple and effective. This is why the 1910 Halley panic was always unfounded. Cometary material doesn't reach ground level in dangerous concentrations because the atmosphere is very good at destroying it. But let's visualize what the enhancement scenario would actually look like. Imagine a stratospheric injection band at 60 to 90 kilometers altitude, glowing green, brightest at the equator where the thermosphere is hottest and reactions run faster. The glow would vary by latitude. Polar regions with cooler thermospheres and different atmospheric circulation patterns might show less enhancement. The equatorial band could pulse as Earth rotates through different density pockets in the tail. From the ground, you'd see a greenish cast to the entire sky, bright enough to cast faint shadows, washing out all but the brightest stars. Photographers would go insane trying to capture it. Social media would explode, and ecologists would start sweating. Here's the scientist's caution box, because honesty matters. The probability of ignition-scale chemistry happening exactly as described is low. Not zero, but low. Most models show that the tail material is too diffuse, The molecular survival rates are too poor, and the energy budgets don't quite close. The scenario requires multiple things to go right or wrong depending on your perspective at the same time. Dense pockets coinciding with Earth's trajectory, peak outgassing during the encounter, efficient energy transfer in atmospheric reactions, minimal turbulent mixing to dilute the concentrations. It's a perfect storm scenario, and perfect storms are rare by definition, but interesting doesn't mean impossible. And edge cases matter when the edge case involves the entire planet. This is why atmospheric chemists model these things, not because they expect disaster, but because understanding the boundaries of possibility is how science works. You run the models with extreme inputs to see where the system breaks. And if nothing else, December 19th will provide real data. We'll get direct measurements of how interstellar comet tails interact with terrestrial atmospheres. That's never been done before. If the sky really does become neon green, what biological systems break first? Because light doesn't just illuminate, light controls life. Part 3. The Neon Night, Ecology, Chronobiology, and Collapse. There's a reason we evolved to sleep when it's dark. Actually, there are about 10,000 reasons, woven into the genetic code of every organism on Earth with a circadian rhythm. Darkness is not just the absence of light, it's a signal, a timer, a regulatory mechanism that controls everything from cell division to hormone release to predator-prey dynamics. And if you break that signal, you break biology in ways that cascade through ecosystems faster than you'd think possible. Let's establish a baseline. A moonless night under natural conditions delivers less than 0.001 lux to the ground. That's dark. Dark enough that your eyes shift to rod-dominated vision. Dark enough that nocturnal animals have evolved exquisite sensitivity to detect the faintest sources of illumination. Now imagine the neon green air glow scenario kicks in, and the night sky brightens to 0.03 to 0.1 lux. That's still dim by human standards. You couldn't read a book, you'd barely see colours. But biologically, that's a disaster. Real-world case studies show what happens when you disrupt nocturnal light regimes. LED sky glow in coastal cities has caused massive seabird disorientation events. Newly fledged birds navigate by starlight, and when artificial light drowns out the stars, they fly toward the glow instead of toward the ocean. They crash into buildings. They exhaust themselves circling light sources. Entire cohorts of juvenile birds die in a single night because the sky looked wrong. Coral reefs time their synchronized spawning events to lunar cycles and seasonal darkness patterns. Introduce artificial light and the synchronization fails. Corals spawn at the wrong times. Gametes don't meet. Reproduction collapses. Insect pollinators, particularly moths and beetles that exclusively forage at night, suffer catastrophic population declines in areas with even modest light pollution. The effect is dose-dependent. More light equals fewer pollinators equals fewer plants. Now scale that to the entire planet. If persistent air glow raises nocturnal irradiance globally by even a factor of 30 to 100, every nocturnal species on Earth experiences disruption simultaneously. Apex nocturnal predators like owls rely on darkness to hunt. Their prey, small mammals and insects, rely on darkness to avoid being eaten. If the night gets brighter, prey species can see predators coming. Predation rates drop. Prey populations spike temporarily, then crash as they overgraze their food sources. Predators starve. The balance tips. Ecosystems that have operated on the same principles for millions of years suddenly encounter a selection pressure that none of their adaptations address. Bats are particularly vulnerable. They navigate and hunt using echolocation, but their activity patterns are still tightly coupled to darkness. Studies show that even low levels of artificial light reduce bat foraging efficiency and increase predation risk from daytime raptors that hunt visually. If bats decline, insect populations explode. Agricultural pests that bats normally suppress multiply unchecked. Farmers spray more pesticides. Pollinator insects die. Crop yields drop. It's a cascade, and it starts with something as simple as the sky being slightly brighter than it should be. Human circadian biology is not immune. The systems that regulate your sleep-wake cycle, your metabolic function, your hormone production, and your immune response all depend on the light-dark contrast being sharp and predictable. Melatonin, the hormone that tells your body it's time to sleep, is exquisitely sensitive to light. Blue-green light in particular, wavelengths around 500 to 550 nanometers, suppresses melatonin production at astonishingly low intensities. The threshold for significant melatonin suppression is around 0.3 lux for blue-green wavelengths. That's 3 to 10 times higher than the enhanced airglow scenario, but it's close enough that chronic exposure could cause measurable effects. Sleep fragmentation, metabolic dysregulation, increased cortisol, reduced immune function, not immediate collapse, but a slow degradation of health that accumulates over weeks and months. Think about fisheries. This is where ecological disruption translates directly to economic catastrophe. Zooplankton, the microscopic animals that form the base of the marine food web, perform something called DL vertical migration. During the day, they hide in deep water to avoid visual predators. At night, they rise to the surface to feed on phytoplankton. This migration is triggered by light levels. If the night sky brightens persistently, zooplankton stay deeper. They feed less efficiently. They grow more slowly. Their populations decline. Everything that eats zooplankton, from larval fish to baleen whales, faces food shortages. Commercial fish stocks plummet. Global fisheries, already strained by overfishing and warming oceans, experience another shock they can't absorb. And here's where it connects back to agriculture. Many of the crop plants we depend on require pollination by insects that are active at specific times of day or night. Nocturnal pollinators, primarily moths and beetles, are responsible for pollinating a surprising number of crops. Tomatoes, peppers, some varieties of beans, various fruit trees. If nocturnal pollinator populations collapse due to persistent airglow disrupting their activity, patterns, those crops see immediate yield reductions. Farmers notice the problem within a single growing season. But by the time you notice pollinator collapse, it's already too late to fix it quickly. Insect populations take years to recover, assuming the selective pressure that caused the collapse is removed. Chronobiology research has established clear quantitative thresholds for these disruptions. At 0.01 lux, most organisms show minimal circadian disruption. At 0.1 lux, measurable effects appear in sensitive species. At 1 lux, major disruption is universal. The hypothetical airglow enhancement sits right in the transition zone, where effects would be noticeable but not catastrophic for most species, devastating for the most sensitive ones. The problem is that ecosystems are not collections of independent species, they're networks. Break one node and the ripple propagates. Imagine this playing out over 3 to 6 months. The enhanced airglow persists longer than anyone expected because the chemistry in the stratosphere is self-sustaining. Every night the sky glows faintly green. Nocturnal animals struggle to adapt. Some species shift their activity periods to earlier or later in the night, trying to find darker windows. But they collide with diurnal species doing the same thing. Competition intensifies. Predation patterns scramble. Plants that depend on specific pollinators at specific times don't get pollinated. Seeds don't form. Forests begin to show patchy regeneration failures. Grasslands shift composition as some species thrive and others collapse. The worst-case scenario isn't a sudden die-off. It's a slow unravelling of ecological relationships that took millions of years to evolve. You wouldn't see it all at once. You'd see it in small signals. Bird migration timing off by a week. Insect emergence not matching flower bloom. Fish spawning in the wrong locations. Each signal small. Each one manageable in isolation. But collectively they represent a system coming apart at the seams. And if the glow doesn't collapse ecosystems immediately, there's something else coming. Something that affects not the light at night, but the light during the day. Because the molecules entering the atmosphere don't just create airglow. They create aerosols, and aerosols change what colour the sun appears to be, which changes what colour light reaches the ground, which changes whether crops can photosynthesize efficiently. The neon night might be just the warning. The red sun effect might be the real killer. Part 4. Red sun smog, photosynthesis by wavelength. You probably think sunlight is just sunlight, bright or dim but fundamentally the same. Plants don't think that way. To a plant, sunlight is a spectrum, and every wavelength carries different information, different energy, different usability. Change the spectrum and you change whether the plant can survive. And if the 3I, Atlas encounter dumps enough hydrocarbon aerosols into the stratosphere, the spectrum reaching Earth's surface could shift in ways that cripple agriculture before anyone understands what's happening. Here's what we're talking about. Methanol and hydrogen cyanide under the intense UV radiation of the upper atmosphere don't just react and disappear, They create secondary products: formaldehyde, methyl radicals, nitriles, complex organic molecules that polymerize into tiny particles, aerosols suspended in the stratosphere. These aerosols scatter light, but they don't scatter all wavelengths equally. They preferentially scatter shorter wavelengths, blues and violets, while allowing longer wavelengths, reds and oranges, to pass through more efficiently. The result is a reddening of sunlight similar to what happens during volcanic eruptions, but potentially more chemically complex and longer lasting. Let's talk about PAR, photosynthetically active radiation. That's the portion of the spectrum plants actually use for photosynthesis, roughly 400 to 700 nanometers, but not all of that range is equally useful. Chlorophyll, the molecule that captures light energy, has two absorption peaks, one in the blue around 450 nanometers, one in the red around 660 nanometers. Green light, ironically, is mostly reflected, which is why plants look green. Different crops have different chlorophyll ratios and different accessory pigments, which means they respond differently to spectral changes. C3 crops like wheat and rice are more dependent on blue light. C4 crops like corn are more efficient at using red light. If you shift the spectrum toward red and away from blue, C3 crops suffer more. Imagine a red sun day. You walk outside and the sunlight looks wrong. Not dark, not dim, but tinted. The sky has an orange-brown haze. The sun itself appears dull red even at noon. Your shadow is weak and fuzzy. Everything looks like it's lit through a sepia filter. This isn't just aesthetic, it's biochemical. The light reaching the ground is depleted in the 400 to 500 nanometer range, the exact wavelengths that chlorophyll needs to drive the light-dependent reactions of photosynthesis. Total brightness might only drop by 10 to 20%, which sounds manageable, but photosynthesis efficiency can drop by 30 to 50% because the light that remains isn't the right kind of light. Crop sensitivity data from volcanic eruption studies gives us a baseline. After Mount Pinatubo erupted in 1991, stratospheric aerosols caused a measurable decline in crop yields globally. Wheat yields dropped by about 2%, rice by 3%. These declines were attributed partly to cooling, but also to the spectral shift in sunlight. The aerosols from Pinatubo were primarily sulfate particles, which scatter light fairly uniformly across the spectrum. The aerosols from 3I Atlas could be more spectrally selective, meaning the effect on photosynthesis could be more severe even with similar total light reduction. Now add the exotic chemistry. Methanol and HCN photochemistry can form not just simple aerosols but complex organic haze resembling the atmosphere of Titan, Saturn's largest moon. Titan's atmosphere is full of photochemically produced organic particles that create a thick orange haze. The chemistry is driven by methane and nitrogen reactions under UV, strikingly similar to what could happen with methanol and HCN in Earth's stratosphere. If Earth's atmosphere starts behaving like Titan's, the spectral effects could be extreme. You'd see sunlight heavily depleted in blue and green, strongly redshifted, creating permanent autumn lighting conditions even in summer. Let's model a worst-case scenario. The 3I Atlas encounter injects enough material to produce aerosol optical depths of 0.1 to 0.3 in the stratosphere. That means 10 to 30% of incoming light is scattered before reaching the ground, with most of the scattering affecting short wavelengths. Wheat fields under these conditions would experience light that's spectrally equivalent to late afternoon or early evening, even at midday. Photosynthetic rates drop by 35 to 40%. Growth slows. Grain filling is incomplete. Yields fall by 25 to 35%, even if total growing season length is unchanged. For rice, the problem is worse. Rice is extremely sensitive to blue light during specific growth stages, particularly during panicle formation when the plant is deciding how many grains to produce. If the spectral shift occurs during this critical window, rice yields could decline by 40 to 50%. You'd see it first in Asia, where rice is the primary staple crop. Within 30 to 60 days of the encounter, agricultural ministries would start reporting anomalies: slower growth, paler leaves, reduced grain set. By 90 days, you'd have confirmed widespread yield failures. Corn, being C4, handles the spectral shift slightly better, but still suffers. Soy, also C3, shows similar vulnerabilities to wheat. The global breadbasket crops that feed most of humanity are all vulnerable to this kind of spectral disruption. And the effect is not linear. A 10% reduction in photosynthetically useful light doesn't mean a 10% yield drop. It can mean a 20 or 30% yield drop because plants have threshold responses. Below certain light intensities, they trigger stress pathways, redirect resources to survival rather than reproduction, and sacrifice grain production to stay alive. Regional famine timelines become terrifyingly short under this scenario. 30 days to recognize the problem, 60 days to confirm it's not local weather or disease, 90 days to see harvest failures, 120 days to exhaust stored grain reserves in affected regions. Emergency food aid systems are designed to handle local disasters, not simultaneous global crop failures. If major grain-producing regions in the Northern Hemisphere experience 30 to 40% yield declines simultaneously, global food markets experience a shock they cannot absorb. Prices spike, export restrictions get imposed, importing nations face shortages, social stability fractures, adaptation strategies exist but they require infrastructure that doesn't exist at scale. Greenhouses can control light spectrum with LED supplementation, ensuring plants get the wavelengths they need regardless of what's happening outside. But global greenhouse capacity represents maybe 2% of total agricultural production. You can't feed 8 billion people on greenhouse crops in any reasonable time frame. Vertical farms are even more limited. They're energy-intensive, expensive, and not scalable to replace field agriculture. Microalgae and controlled environment agriculture could help but require years of build-out. Historical aerosol events provide some guidance. The Tambora eruption of 1816 caused the year without a summer. Global temperatures dropped, spectral effects occurred, and widespread crop failures led to famine in Europe, North America, and Asia. But Tambora's aerosols were primarily sulfate-based and cleared from the atmosphere within 2 to 3 years. If 3i Atlas produces organic aerosols that are chemically more stable, they could persist for 5 to 10 years, creating a sustained agricultural crisis that fundamentally reshapes global food systems. Could continuous injection produce permanent autumn lighting? Not truly permanent, but potentially multi-year. If the comet's tail continues to interact with Earth's atmosphere on subsequent orbits, or if the initial aerosol injection is large enough to sustain stratospheric concentrations for years, you'd see prolonged spectral shifts. Crops would adapt over time. Natural selection would favour varieties that can photosynthesize more efficiently under red-shifted light. But that adaptation takes generations. Human agriculture operates on annual cycles. We don't have time to wait for evolution. And here's what nobody wants to think about. If cyanide derivatives settle out of the atmosphere and enter water and soil systems, the spectral shift isn't the only long-term problem. Because chronic low-level exposure to certain nitrogen compounds can do something insidious. They can quietly erode the cognitive capacity of entire populations without anyone noticing until it's too late. What happens long-term if cyanide derivatives enter water systems and start accumulating in the food chain? Part 5. Hydrology, Bioaccumulation, and IQ. The long tail. There's a particular horror to invisible poisons, not the ones that kill you immediately. Those at least have the decency to be obvious. The truly insidious poisons are the ones that reduce you by imperceptible increments over years, stealing cognitive functions so gradually that by the time you realize something is wrong, a generation has already been affected. Cyanide derivatives entering the hydrological cycle wouldn't cause immediate mass casualties. They'd cause something worse, a slow degradation of human intellectual capacity that compounds over decades. Let's start with the deposition mechanism. Aerosols don't stay in the stratosphere forever. They settle, they get washed out by rain, they attach to dust particles that eventually fall to the surface. If 3i Atlas produces nitriles, complex organic molecules containing cyanide groups, and formaldehyde as atmospheric reaction products, these compounds will eventually make it to the ground. The question is concentration. Natural rainout from volcanic aerosols deposits measurable but harmless quantities of various compounds. But if the aerosol loading is high enough, and the chemistry is exotic enough, concentrations in rainfall could exceed background levels by orders of magnitude. Computer simulations of stratospheric aerosol deposition show that particles injected at 20 to 30 kilometers altitude take 6 months to 2 years to fully settle out, depending on particle size and stratospheric circulation patterns. During this time, they spread globally but concentrate in certain latitudes based on atmospheric transport. Mid-latitudes in both hemispheres receive the highest deposition rates. That's where most of the world's major agricultural regions and freshwater sources are located. If nitrile-containing aerosols deposit at rates of 10 to 100 micrograms per square metre per year, and this continues for 2 to 5 years as the aerosols clear, total deposition could reach milligrams per square metre. That doesn't sound like much. But concentrations in groundwater depend on infiltration rates, soil chemistry, and aquifer characteristics. In some hydrogeological settings, parts per billion accumulation is plausible. Groundwater simulation models show the worst-case scenario: shallow aquifers with high recharge rates from rainfall, low organic matter content in soil, which would normally bind and degrade nitriles, and slow groundwater flow could accumulate thiocyanate and related compounds at levels approaching 1 to 10 parts per billion over several years. That's below acute toxicity thresholds. You wouldn't die from drinking this water, but chronic exposure at these levels triggers biochemical disruptions that are subtle and cumulative. Cyanide, even at very low concentrations, interferes with cellular respiration by binding to cytochrome C oxidase, the final enzyme in the electron transport chain. The effect is dose-dependent. High doses are lethal within minutes. Low doses, sustained over months or years, cause chronic cellular energy deficits. Cells adapt, but at a cost. Thyroid function is particularly sensitive because the thyroid uses a lot of energy and depends on efficient cellular respiration. Chronic cyanide exposure, even at parts per billion levels, can cause thyroid hormone deficiencies that manifest as metabolic slowdown, weight gain, fatigue, and, critically, developmental problems in children. The well-studied case is cassava. In regions where cassava is a dietary staple and people don't process it properly to remove natural cyanogenic compounds, chronic cyanide exposure from food causes a condition called konzo, a permanent neurological disorder. It also causes goiter and in some studies correlates with reduced IQ in children. The mechanism involves thiocyanate, a cyanide metabolite that accumulates in the body and interferes with iodine uptake by the thyroid. Without adequate iodine, the thyroid can't produce sufficient hormones. Insufficient thyroid hormones during critical developmental windows in childhood leads to irreversible cognitive impairment. Not massive impairment, not profound disability, just a reduction. 5 to 10 IQ points on average, enough to shift the entire distribution of a population's intellectual capacity downward. Now imagine this playing out globally, not from cassava, but from trace cyanide derivatives in drinking water. The exposure is lower than cassava-related exposure. The effects are subtler, but the population at risk is everyone. Children born and raised during the decade after the 3I Atlas encounter could show measurably lower cognitive test scores compared to previous cohorts. The effect would be small, within the noise of normal variation, difficult to detect without large epidemiological studies. But small effects on large populations have massive consequences. A 5-point average IQ reduction in a population of 8 billion people means billions of individuals slightly less capable of complex problem solving, slightly less able to master technical fields, slightly more vulnerable to manipulation and poor decision-making. The economic costs alone would be staggering. Reduced productivity, lower innovation rates, decreased scientific output, and the worst part. You wouldn't know it was happening until an entire generation had already been affected. Differences in rainfall patterns and aquifer vulnerability mean some regions would be hit harder than others. Areas with shallow aquifers, high precipitation, and low buffering capacity in soils would see higher concentrations. Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of South Asia, and some regions of Latin America fit this profile. There are also regions with limited resources for water treatment and public health monitoring. The populations most vulnerable to chronic low-level poisoning are the ones least equipped to detect and respond to it. Aquaculture and fisheries face similar risks. Fish are exquisitely sensitive to cyanide. Concentrations that are harmless to humans can be lethal to fish larvae and disruptive to adult fish behavior. If nitrile compounds deposit into rivers, lakes, and coastal waters, freshwater and marine ecosystems experience toxicity events that cascade through food webs. Commercial fish stocks decline. Subsistence fishing communities lose their protein sources. Coastal nations dependent on seafood face nutritional crises. And because fish bioaccumulate certain compounds, People eating contaminated fish could receive higher exposures than people drinking contaminated water. The monitoring networks that would detect this are sparse and unevenly distributed. NOAA operates water quality sensors on major rivers and coastal regions in the United States. EPA monitors drinking water supplies for a limited set of contaminants, but nitriles and unusual cyanide derivatives might not be on the standard testing panel. Developing nations have even less monitoring infrastructure. If contamination is happening, it could go undetected for years. By the time someone notices anomalous IQ trends in birth cohorts, the exposure has already occurred. You can't undo cognitive damage that happens during critical developmental periods. It's permanent. Uncertainty ranges on all of this are enormous. The chemistry of atmospheric aerosol formation from methanol and HCN under Earth-specific conditions has never been observed. The deposition rates are modelled, not measured. The hydrogeological fate of these compounds in diverse aquifer systems is poorly constrained. The toxicological thresholds for chronic low-level exposure in human populations are extrapolated from limited studies. Any one of these uncertainties could make the entire scenario implausible. But any one of them could also make it worse than predicted. Where is scientific confidence strongest? In the atmospheric chemistry. We know HCN reacts with atomic oxygen. We know methanol photolyzes. We know aerosols form. Where is confidence weakest? In the long-term ecological and human health impacts. We've never seen this before. We have no data. We're extrapolating from related but not identical scenarios and hoping the extrapolation is valid. If this isn't just chemistry, if there's something else going on with 3I Atlas that we're missing, then maybe we're focusing on the wrong threat entirely. Because some objects in space are stranger than simple chemistry can explain, and when you look at the data closely, really closely, you start seeing patterns that don't quite fit. Jets that spray at odd angles, emission rates that pulse when they should be steady. Spectroscopic signatures that are just slightly wrong. Natural explanations work, they always do, but they require assuming a lot of coincidences happen at once. And in science, when you need too many coincidences to explain something, maybe you're not asking the right questions. What else is going on with this object? And if we can't trust the simple chemistry story, what should we be looking at instead? Part 6. Production. What 3I Atlas actually emits. Let's get empirical. All the speculation about atmospheric chemistry and ecological collapse rests on a single assumption, that 3I Atlas is actually producing the molecules we think it's producing at the rates we think it's producing them. If that assumption is wrong, everything downstream collapses. So what does the data actually say? And more importantly, what are the error bars? The primary observations come from ALMA, the Atacama Large Millimeter Array, and JCMT, the James Clerk Maxwell Telescope. Both instruments detected rotational emission lines from hydrogen cyanide and methanol in the coma and tail of 3I Atlas. The measurements are real, the molecules are there, but converting spectroscopic line flux into actual mass loss rates requires making assumptions about temperature, coma expansion velocity, beam dilution, and excitation conditions. Every one of those assumptions carries uncertainty. Stack up multiple uncertainties and your final number can vary by a factor of 3 to 10. Here's what the observations show. HCN emission at 88.6 GHz, with a line strength of approximately 3.5 Kelvin kilometer per second. That sounds precise. It isn't. To convert that line strength into a production rate, you need to know the excitation temperature of the molecules. Are they thermalized? Are they subthermally excited? The difference changes your calculated production rate by a factor of 2. Then you need to know the expansion velocity of the coma. Is gas leaving the nucleus at 0.5 kilometers per second or 1 kilometer per second? That's another factor of 2. Beam dilution, the fact that the telescope beam is larger than the emitting region, adds another factor of uncertainty. By the time you propagate all the errors, the HCN production rate could be anywhere from 2 to 15 times 10 to the 26th molecules per second. Methanol measurements show similar uncertainties. The observed line strengths are strong, among the highest ever measured for a comet. But translating that into total methanol production requires knowing the rotational temperature distribution of the molecules, which we infer from multiple line ratios. If the temperature distribution is non-thermal, which some observations suggest, the standard conversion formulas break down. You end up with production rate estimates that span a full order of magnitude. That's the difference between interesting astronomical object and potential atmospheric hazard. The jet morphology adds another layer of complexity. Multiple observation epochs show that 3I Atlas exhibits strong jets, collimated streams of gas and dust, ejected from specific active regions on the nucleus. These jets are not steady. They appear to pulse or vary in intensity over timescales of hours to days. Some of this variation is geometric, caused by the nucleus rotating and pointing jets toward or away from Earth. But some of the variation appears to be intrinsic. The nucleus is actively changing its outgassing behavior, possibly due to subsurface pressure buildup and release, possibly due to fracturing of surface ice layers. Could a coherent dense wake exist without fragmentation? That's the critical question for the December 19th scenario. If the gas and dust ejected by 3I Atlas stays concentrated in a narrow stream, Earth could pass through a dense pocket with dramatically higher molecule counts than the average tail density. But cometary tails usually disperse. Solar radiation pressure pushes dust particles. The solar wind drags ionized gas. Turbulence mixes everything. Creating a dense, long-lived wake requires special conditions. Either the ejection velocities are higher than normal, keeping material concentrated, or the material is being continuously replenished as Earth passes through. Or there are fragment swarms, multiple small icy bodies travelling together and all outgassing simultaneously. Fragment swarm scenarios are plausible but unconfirmed. Some comets, when they get close to the Sun, break apart into dozens or hundreds of smaller pieces. Each piece outgasses independently. From a distance, it looks like a single object with a very active coma. But up close, it's a cloud of fragments. If 3I Atlas is actually a swarm, Earth might pass through multiple concentrated pockets separated by relatively empty space. The atmospheric effects would be episodic, brief intense pulses of chemistry rather than sustained enhancement. That changes the biological impact calculation significantly. Ecosystems can handle short-duration stress much better than chronic stress. Anisotropic jets that don't spray radially outward, can create structured tails under certain conditions. If the nucleus is rotating with specific active regions that turn on and off as they face the Sun, and if the rotation axis is oriented in a particular way, the combined effect of multiple jets can produce a corkscrew or spiral pattern in the tail. From Earth's perspective, this might look like density bands. We'd pass through high-density regions alternating with low-density regions. The timing and spacing of these bands depend on the nucleus rotation period and the geometry of our encounter. We don't know the rotation period precisely enough to predict this. Comparing 3I Atlas to other interstellar objects provides context. 1I/Oumuamua, the first confirmed interstellar visitor, showed non-gravitational acceleration suggesting outgassing, but no detectable coma. 2I/Borisov, the second interstellar comet, showed normal cometary activity with water, CO, and CN emissions typical of solar system comets. 3I Atlas is different. Its HCN and methanol dominance is unusual, not impossible, but rare. Some solar system comets show HCN-rich compositions, but they're the exception. The interstellar origin might mean 3I Atlas formed in a different stellar environment with different chemical conditions. Or it might mean something else. High-end models, using the maximum plausible production rates and assuming dense weight concentration, predict column densities during Earth's passage that could reach 10 to the 15th molecules per square centimetre for HCN. That's the threshold where atmospheric chemistry models start showing significant airglow enhancement. Low-end models, using conservative production rates and assuming normal tail dispersion, predict column densities 2 to 3 orders of magnitude lower. At those levels, atmospheric effects are negligible. Detectable with sensitive instruments, but not visible or biologically relevant. The critical physical bottleneck that makes sky ignition extremely unlikely is photodissociation. Even if 3I Atlas dumps enormous quantities of HCN and methanol into Earth's path, most of it photodissociates in the upper thermosphere within seconds to minutes of arrival. The molecules don't survive long enough to accumulate. They hit, react, and disappear. Only if the mass flux is so high that it overwhelms the photodissociation rate, or if molecules somehow avoid photolysis and reach lower altitudes, do you get sustained chemistry. Both scenarios require extreme conditions that are theoretically possible but statistically unlikely. So where does that leave us? with an object that is definitely unusual, possibly interesting, probably harmless, but not definitively understood. The observations are good enough to confirm exotic chemistry. They're not good enough to rule out surprises, and the error bars on critical parameters are large enough that worst-case scenarios remain within the realm of physical possibility, even if they're outside the realm of high probability. But what if the error bars are hiding something? What if the emissions we're measuring aren't random? What if they're showing patterns that don't fit natural explanations as neatly as everyone assumes? Because when you look at the jet structures, really look at them, some of the vectors don't point where simple sublimation physics says they should. And that raises a question nobody wants to ask out loud. Could this object be doing something intentional? Part 7. Engineered or natural? The terraforming hypothesis. Let's be very clear about what we're doing here. We're about to discuss something that mainstream astronomy considers fringe speculation at best and dangerous pseudoscience at worst. But intellectual honesty requires examining possibilities even when they're uncomfortable. So here's the question. Is there any evidence, any at all, that 3I Atlas's chemical emissions are intentionally designed to alter planetary atmospheres? And if we're being rigorous, what would that evidence look like? The planetary fumigation hypothesis exists primarily in speculative xenobiology, and a few very carefully worded scientific papers that discuss it as a cultural motif rather than a serious claim. The idea is simple. An advanced civilization, either now or in the deep past, could use comets as interstellar dispersal mechanisms for atmospheric modification agents. Load a comet with specific chemicals, aim it at a target star system, wait a few million years. The comet enters the system, passes near inhabited or potentially habitable planets, and releases its payload. The chemistry does the rest. It's planetary-scale engineering using natural objects as delivery vehicles. Before you dismiss this as science fiction, consider what evidence you'd need to upgrade it from fiction to hypothesis. You'd need several things. First, abnormal isotopic ratios. Natural solar system materials have isotopic compositions that vary within known ranges. If 3I Atlas showed isotopic ratios of carbon, nitrogen, or oxygen that fell way outside those ranges, it would suggest formation conditions or processing that don't occur naturally. Second, regular pulsed emissions. Natural outgassing is chaotic, driven by thermal cycling and internal pressure changes. Intentionally controlled emissions would show regularity, periodicity, or synchronization that's too precise to be coincidental. Third, vectorized ejection. Jets pointing in non-radial directions can be natural, but jets that actively vector material toward a specific target would be suspicious. Fourth, narrowband non-thermal radiation. If the object emitted radio or optical signals that didn't match blackbody or thermal emission spectra, that would indicate technology. Fifth, synchronized jet modulation. Multiple jets turning on and off in coordinated patterns would suggest centralized control rather than independent thermal response. If you observed all 5 of these, you'd have a compelling case for artificiality. If you observed 1 or 2, you'd have ambiguity. If you observed none, you'd have a natural object. What does 3I Atlas actually show? No public evidence of abnormal isotopic ratios. The limited isotopic measurements available are consistent with solar system or interstellar medium composition within error bars. Regular pulsed emissions? Unclear. Some observations suggest variability, but variability is common in comets and can be explained by rotation and thermal lag. Vectorized ejection? This is where it gets interesting. Some of the observed jets do show non-radial outflow vectors. They're not pointing directly away from the sun. They're angled. That can be natural if the active regions are on slopes, or if the nucleus is rotating in a way that creates apparent vectoring. But it's also consistent with directed ejection. Narrowband non-thermal radiation? None detected. 3I Atlas emits thermal radiation and molecular line emission exactly as expected for a comet. No anomalous signals. Synchronized jet modulation? Unknown. We don't have continuous high-resolution monitoring to determine if jets are independently variable or coordinated. The data is sparse, limited to snapshots separated by hours or days. You can't detect synchronization without continuous observation. Natural processes can mimic intentional patterns with disturbing fidelity. Rotational harmonics, the way a spinning object's geometry creates repeated patterns, can look regular without being designed. Diurnal heating cycles, The day-night temperature swing as the nucleus rotates can modulate outgassing in ways that appear pulsed. Microfractures in surface ice can open and close periodically as thermal expansion and contraction occur, creating episodic jets. All of these are well understood, well-documented natural phenomena. They explain the observations without requiring technology. But let's engage the xenobiology thought experiment. Would any species realistically use HCN and methanol as terraforming agents? That depends on what you're trying to terraform. If you're trying to make a planet more habitable for carbon-based life, dumping cyanide seems counterproductive. But if you're trying to modify atmospheric chemistry to create specific precursor molecules for more complex synthesis, it might make sense. HCN is a key precursor in prebiotic chemistry. The Miller-Urey experiment, which simulated early Earth conditions, produced amino acids and other organic molecules from HCN, methanol and water. Maybe the goal isn't to sterilize, maybe it's to seed, to provide the chemical building blocks for life to emerge or evolve in a particular direction. The gardener's spray analogy appears in panspermia literature. The idea that life spreads through the galaxy not by spaceship but by chemical seeding events. Comets hit young planets and deliver the initial chemistry needed for life to start. Directed panspermia, proposed seriously by scientists like Francis Crick, suggests that this could be intentional. If you want to spread your form of life, you don't send colonists. You send chemistry. Let natural processes do the rest. 3i Atlas, under this framework, could be a garden implement, applying nutrients, so to speak, to a planetary garden. SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has protocols for evaluating ambiguous objects. The Rio scale, analogous to the Richter scale for earthquakes, quantifies the significance of potential SETI detections. A Rio scale score depends on the consequences of the signal and the credibility of the evidence. 3i Atlas would score low on credibility, no technological signatures, but potentially high on consequences if its emissions were proven intentional. The scientific consensus is that ambiguous cases with natural explanations don't warrant elevated attention until natural explanations fail. 3i Atlas hasn't failed natural explanations yet, but it's pushing them. The debate between natural and engineered interpretations matters because it changes how we respond. If 3i Atlas is natural, we monitor, we study, we adapt if necessary, but we don't fundamentally question our place in the universe. If it's engineered, even if it's an abandoned relic from a long-dead civilization, the implications are staggering. Someone else is out there. They have the capability to engineer interstellar objects. They thought about us, or at least about planetary systems like ours. Suddenly we're not alone, and we're not in control. That's terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The science can't answer this yet. Maybe it never will. What it can do is define the boundaries of plausibility, identify what observations would shift the probability, and keep the question open without letting speculation overwhelm evidence. 3i Atlas is almost certainly natural. Almost, but almost is not definitely, and in the space between those two words, there's room for wonder and caution. Whether the object is engineered or not, the politics around it absolutely are, because nothing reveals the fault lines in human civilization quite like an ambiguous threat from space. And the way governments, corporations, and individuals respond to 3i Atlas tells you more about us than it does about the comet. Part 8. The Politics of Panic, Masks, Mandates, and the Bunker Elite. 1910. Halley's Comet approaches Earth. Astronomers announce that Earth will pass through the tail. Spectroscopy detects cyanide compounds. Newspapers scream about poison gas from space. Panic spreads. Enterprising charlatans sell anti-comet pills made of sugar and chalk. People seal their windows. Some hold their breath as the comet passes. Others party like it's the end of the world. When it's over and everyone is still alive, the entrepreneurs vanish with their profits, and humanity collectively pretends it was never scared in the first place. The psychology hasn't changed in 115 years. Only the delivery mechanisms have improved. In 2025, you don't need newspapers to spread panic. You need a Twitter thread, a TikTok video, and an algorithm optimized for engagement. Fear drives engagement better than anything else. So the algorithm rewards fear, and suddenly every person with a basic understanding of chemistry and a smartphone becomes an amateur astronomer predicting apocalypse. Modern equivalents of anti-comet pills are already appearing. Online retailers show a spike in sales of activated charcoal filters, N95 masks and portable air purifiers. None of these would do anything if HCN actually reached ground level, which it won't. But the perception of protection matters more than actual protection. People buy things to feel like they're doing something. Action reduces anxiety, so they buy masks, they buy filters, they buy survival supplies, the market responds, prices rise, supply chains strain, and the panic becomes self-fulfilling. Not because the threat is real, but because the response to the perceived threat creates real shortages, which government responses make scientific sense. High-altitude atmospheric sampling makes sense. NASA, NOAA, and similar agencies should be flying ER-2 aircraft, or high-altitude balloons equipped with mass spectrometers to directly sample the air between 20 and 50 kilometers altitude during the encounter. This would provide definitive data on molecular concentrations and chemistry. Aviation advisories make sense. If there's any possibility of unusual atmospheric conditions affecting aircraft performance or instrumentation, pilots need to know. Publishing transparent data in real time makes sense. Let independent researchers analyze the observations, crowdsource the interpretation. More eyes reduce the chance of missing something important. What doesn't make sense? Symbolic theatre, mobilizing emergency services without clear protocols, issuing vague warnings that amplify fear without providing actionable guidance, restricting information to prevent panic, which always causes more panic than transparency would. The history of public health communication is littered with examples of governments thinking they're protecting people by controlling information only to destroy trust and make the situation worse when the truth inevitably leaks. Disinformation networks thrive in information vacuums. When official sources don't provide clear, detailed, trustworthy information, people turn to alternative sources that fill the gap. Some of those sources are well-meaning but wrong. Others are deliberately exploiting fear for profit or influence. Identifying which is nearly impossible for most people, so you get a fractal cascade of mutually contradictory claims. 3i Atlas is nothing to worry about. 3i Atlas will kill millions. 3i Atlas is a government experiment. 3i Atlas is aliens. Each claim finds an audience. Each audience becomes more entrenched. Consensus fractures. Who benefits from panic? Manufacturers of filtration equipment and survival supplies. Financial markets. Because volatility creates opportunities for traders betting on fear. Media companies. Because panic drives clicks and views. Political actors who can position themselves as protectors or truth-tellers, and anyone with a bunker to sell. Which brings us to the bunker elite phenomenon. Public procurement records, which are generally accessible, show something interesting. In the months leading up to the 3i Atlas encounter, there's been a notable uptick in government contracts for air filtration systems, high-altitude balloon launches, and atmospheric monitoring equipment. That's reasonable and expected. But there's also been an increase in private sector construction permits for underground facilities, hardened structures, and secure storage installations. Some of this is probably coincidental. Bunker construction happens for lots of reasons. But the timing raises eyebrows. The bunker elite narrative is simple. Rich people know something you don't. They're building shelters because they have insider information about how bad the 3i Atlas encounter will be. The narrative is compelling because it taps into existing class resentments and distrust of wealth and power. It's also probably wrong. Most bunker construction is driven by generic anxiety about civilizational instability, not specific knowledge about comets. But the narrative spreads because it feels right. It fits the pattern. And in a world where conspiracy theories have been proven correct often enough to erode trust in official denials, people don't know what to believe. Risk communication failures escalate panic faster than actual chemical exposure ever could. When authorities underestimate public intelligence and provide overly simplistic reassurances, they breed suspicion. When they overcomplicate messages with technical jargon, they create confusion. The sweet spot is rare. Clear, honest, appropriately nuanced communication that respects public intelligence while providing actionable information. Most government risk communication falls on one side or the other of that sweet spot, and the result is a population that doesn't trust what they're being told. Compare this to pandemic-era governance errors. Early messaging about masks was confusing and contradictory, driven partly by supply concerns and partly by incomplete scientific understanding. The result was erosion of trust that persisted for years. Lockdowns were imposed with poor communication about the reasoning, creating resentment and non-compliance. Vaccine rollouts faced hesitancy, amplified by decades of declining institutional trust. The pattern is consistent. Governments fail at risk communication, public trust collapses, harmful behaviours increase, outcomes worsen. Models show how fear drives supply chain collapse faster than physical disasters. If 10% of the population panic buys 2 months of food supplies simultaneously, grocery stores empty within days. Restocking takes weeks. During those weeks, more people panic. A 30% panic threshold, where 1/3 of the population is actively hoarding, can crash food distribution systems in major cities within 10 days. You don't need an actual famine. You just need fear of famine. The fear becomes the famine. Is the chemistry even the main problem, or are we looking at the wrong threat? Because if 3I Atlas is mostly a natural object doing natural things, and the atmospheric effects are minimal, but the panic response causes supply chain failures, economic disruption, and social instability, then the real hazard isn't the comet, it's us. We're the threat to ourselves. And unlike comets, we're very hard to predict. But let's return to the science. What if we've been focusing on gas phase chemistry when the real action is something else entirely? Dust, fragments, electromagnetic effects. There are multiple ways to create unusual atmospheric phenomena without requiring massive chemical loading, and some of them might explain the observations better than the HCN scenario does. Part 9. Alternate scenarios, fragment swarm, electrostatic dust, or plasma-driven effects. Chemistry isn't the only game in town. When you're trying to understand how a comet tail interacts with Earth's atmosphere, focusing exclusively on molecular reactions means you might miss the actual mechanism. Because there are other ways to light up the sky, other ways to disrupt ecosystems, other ways for an interstellar object to mess with a planet, and some of them are grounded in physics that's just as solid as the chemistry, but less intuitively obvious. Start with fragment swarms. Comets break apart. It's what they do. Solar heating creates internal pressure. Weak structure can't hold. The nucleus fractures into dozens, hundreds, sometimes thousands of smaller pieces. Each fragment has its own surface area exposed to sunlight. Each one outgasses independently. From Earth, if the fragments are close together, it looks like a single highly active comet. But up close, it's a cloud. And if Earth passes through a fragment swarm, the encounter isn't a smooth transit through a diffuse tail. It's a series of localized, intense bursts as we intersect individual fragments. Fragment swarms concentrate material in space more effectively than diffuse tails. A single cubic kilometre of space might contain relatively little gas from a normal tail. But if that same cubic kilometre happens to intersect a small, icy fragment, actively outgassing, the local concentration spikes by factors of 100 to 1000. Earth, moving at 30 kilometers per second, would pass through these pockets in seconds. Each encounter would inject a pulse of molecules into the atmosphere. The atmospheric chemistry would respond. Then it would relax before the next pulse. The biological and optical effects would be episodic rather than sustained. Electrostatic charging of dust grains is a phenomenon that's well documented in interstellar space, but rarely considered for cometary tails near planets. Dust grains, tiny particles of silicate or carbon, pick up electric charges through photoelectric emission when UV light knocks electrons off their surfaces. In the vacuum of space, these grains can accumulate substantial charge. Charged grains interact with magnetic fields. They can be accelerated, deflected, and concentrated in ways that neutral dust cannot. If 3I Atlas's tail contains significant amounts of electrostatically charged dust, Earth's magnetosphere could funnel that dust toward the poles, creating concentrated deposits in high-latitude regions. Charged dust entering Earth's magnetosphere does something interesting. It doesn't just fall, it spirals. Following magnetic field lines, particles get trapped in the Van Allen belts, circulating around Earth before eventually precipitating into the atmosphere at high latitudes. This is exactly how auroras work, except auroras are caused by charged particles from the solar wind, mostly protons and electrons. Charged dust would behave similarly, but with different optical signatures. Instead of the typical green and red auroral colours from oxygen and nitrogen emissions, You might see scattering and fluorescence from dust grains themselves. The sky could glow in unusual colours depending on dust composition. Plasma tail interactions with Earth's magnetosphere could enhance auroras without requiring dangerous chemistry. Comets have two tails, a dust tail pushed by solar radiation pressure and an ion tail pushed by the solar wind. Ion tails are plasma, ionized gas that's magnetically active. If Earth passes through 3I Atlas's ion tail, the interaction isn't primarily chemical, it's electromagnetic. Plasma from the comet collides with Earth's magnetosphere. Energy transfers, particles get accelerated, aurora activity spikes dramatically. You'd see intense auroral displays possibly visible at mid-latitudes, possibly lasting for hours or days. From the ground, it looks like the sky's on fire, but there's no toxicity, no chemical disruption, just a spectacular light show driven by electromagnetic coupling. Nanodust catalysis is speculative, but appears in scientific literature discussing atmospheric chemistry under exotic conditions. The idea is that tiny dust particles, nanometers to micrometers in size, can act as catalytic surfaces for chemical reactions. Molecules adsorb onto the dust surface, react more efficiently than they would in gas phase, and then desorb. If 3I Atlas injects significant nanodust into Earth's atmosphere, and if that dust has the right surface chemistry, it could enhance airglow reactions without requiring huge gas phase molecule concentrations. The dust acts as a catalyst, amplifying the chemistry disproportionately. Could charged dust boost airglow without chemical toxicity? Absolutely. The mechanism would be indirect. Charged particles precipitating into the atmosphere deposit kinetic energy. That energy dissociates oxygen and nitrogen molecules, creating atomic oxygen and excited nitrogen. Atomic oxygen drives natural airglow chemistry. More atomic oxygen means more airglow. The process doesn't require exotic molecules like HCN or methanol, it just requires energy input. If 3I Atlas delivers enough charged dust to Earth's magnetosphere, the energy budget could support sustained airglow enhancement purely through electromagnetic effects. Optical signatures distinguish these mechanisms. Gas phase chemistry produces specific emission lines, 557 nanometers for green airglow, 630 nanometers for red. Dust scattering produces broadband emission, no sharp spectral features. Plasma interactions drive auroral emissions with characteristic oxygen and nitrogen lines, but at different intensity ratios than normal auroras. If observers on December 19th see broadband glow rather than line emission, that points toward dust. If they see typical auroral colours but at unusual latitudes or intensities, that points toward plasma. If they see the specific 557 nanometer green line enhanced globally, that points toward gas phase chemistry. The hypothesis of engineered aerosols hitching a ride on 3I Atlas enters the realm of clearly speculative xenobiology, but let's address it. If an advanced civilization wanted to modify Earth's atmosphere using a comet as a delivery vehicle, they wouldn't rely on natural outgassing chemistry. They'd embed designed particles, nanomachines, or engineered biomolecules in the tail. When Earth passes through, these particles enter the atmosphere, survive entry by design, and begin their programmed functions. Atmospheric modification, planetary engineering, terraforming. The comet is just the delivery system. The real payload is artificial. What evidence would support this? You'd need to find particles with structures that don't match any known natural formation process. Crystalline arrays too regular, molecular assemblies too complex. Isotopic signatures indicating deliberate synthesis. And you'd need to find these particles in atmospheric samples collected during or after the encounter. So far, no such evidence exists, but nobody's looked carefully yet because nobody expects to find it. And that's a classic observational bias. You don't see what you're not looking for. Diagnostic indicators scientists would use to distinguish mechanisms include spectral analysis of any observed glow, magnetic field perturbations measured by satellites, particle composition analysis from high-altitude sampling, radar backscatter signatures from dust clouds, and timing patterns. If effects are pulsed and correlated with specific trajectory intersections that suggest fragments. If effects are correlated with geomagnetic activity and concentrate at high latitudes, that suggests plasma or charged dust. If effects are globally uniform and spectroscopically consistent with HCN chemistry, That suggests gas phase reactions. Which scenario fits current data best? Honestly, none of them fit perfectly because the data is incomplete. We have spectroscopic evidence of HCN and methanol which supports gas phase chemistry. We have observed jet structures, which could indicate fragmentation. We have no direct measurements of dust-charged states or plasma interactions with Earth's magnetosphere because those haven't been studied yet. December 19th will provide data. Until then, we're in the uncomfortable position of knowing something unusual is happening, but not knowing which unusual thing it is. And that uncertainty opens the door to a more uncomfortable question. If we don't know which mechanism is real, is someone hiding key data that would tell us? Because in the world of planetary defense and national security, not all astronomical observations are public. Some are classified. And if there's data suggesting 3I Atlas is more than just a comet, would we even be allowed to know? Part 10. Who knows what, when, forensics of secrecy. There's a classification regime for astronomical data that most people don't know exists. Not everything you see in the sky is public information. Orbital trajectories of certain satellites are classified. High-resolution imagery of sensitive installations taken by commercial satellites is restricted. And data from planetary defense systems, the networks designed to detect and track near-Earth objects, can be classified if it has national security implications. So when we ask what's really known about 3I Atlas, we're not just asking what scientists have published, we're asking what hasn't been published, and why. Planetary defense offices, primarily NASA's Planetary Defense Coordination Office and ESA's NEO Coordination Center, classify data based on several criteria. If an object poses a credible impact threat, early data might be restricted to prevent panic until the trajectory is refined. If an object exhibits unusual properties that could indicate something other than natural origin, data might be restricted pending further analysis. If observations involve classified sensors, the data is restricted by default regardless of what it shows. The goal is to balance public safety with avoiding unnecessary alarm, but the line between appropriate caution and excessive secrecy is thin and often crossed. Atmospheric sampling data is where secrecy becomes most problematic. Governments run high-altitude sampling programs using aircraft, balloons, and satellites to monitor atmospheric composition. These programs track nuclear test debris, volcanic aerosols, and anthropogenic pollutants. If 3I Atlas injected unusual molecules into the stratosphere, these sensors would detect it. But the data might not be released publicly, especially if it shows concentrations higher than expected or chemistry that's difficult to explain. National security classification can extend to environmental data if that data reveals sensor capabilities or operational details. Historical examples abound. In the early days of near-Earth object detection, asteroid trajectories that suggested possible Earth impacts were sometimes kept quiet until the trajectories were refined and the threat ruled out. The reasoning was sound: avoid causing panic over false alarms. But the policy created distrust. People wondered what else was being hidden. After several incidents where preliminary impact warnings leaked before official announcements, NASA adopted a more transparent policy. Now, impact probabilities are published on the Sentry system in near real time. But that transparency applies only to impact risks, not to other anomalous properties objects might exhibit. FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act, allows US citizens to request government documents, but FOIA has exceptions. National security information is exempt, classified data is exempt, pre-decisional deliberations are exempt. If a scientist at NASA observed something unusual about 3I Atlas and wrote an internal memo discussing it, that memo could be withheld under deliberative process exemptions. If atmospheric sampling detected unexpected compounds and the data was collected by military sensors, it could be withheld under national security exemptions. The result is that FOIA, while useful, can't guarantee access to the information most relevant to public safety. Procurement documents, which are generally public, provide indirect evidence of government activity. If NASA suddenly contracts for emergency atmospheric sampling missions, that appears in procurement records. If the Department of Defense tasks satellites to monitor a specific region of space, contract awards might hint at unusual activity. Observers who track these documents sometimes notice patterns. A spike in atmospheric monitoring contracts in the months before December 19th would suggest that agencies are preparing for something. The absence of such contracts would suggest either that they're not concerned or that the preparations are being conducted through classified channels. Private sector monitoring complicates the picture. Commercial satellite companies like Planet, Maxar, and others operate imaging constellations that can observe astronomical objects. Private researchers with access to these resources sometimes make observations that governments would prefer remained private. There's no legal mechanism to prevent private researchers from publishing observations of celestial objects. But there are informal pressures, funding dependencies, security clearances that could be revoked, polite requests from officials to delay publication pending verification. These pressures are real and documented, though rarely discussed publicly. Misinterpretation of secrecy is where conspiracy theories thrive. When governments withhold information for legitimate reasons like protecting sensor capabilities or avoiding panic over uncertain threats, observers interpret the secrecy as evidence of a cover-up. The logic is understandable. If there's nothing to hide, why hide anything? But the premise is flawed. Secrecy often has mundane explanations. The challenge is distinguishing legitimate secrecy from illegitimate cover-ups when you don't have access to the classified information yourself. Where is transparency good? Open publication of observational data, real-time updates on object trajectories, clear communication about what is and isn't known, public access to atmospheric monitoring results from unclassified sensors. These things build trust and enable independent verification. Where is transparency lacking? Classification of atmospheric sampling data, delays in publishing observations of anomalous objects, refusal to disclose what sensors are being used and what their capabilities are, vague public statements that raise more questions than they answer. What we still don't know as December 19th approaches is substantial. We don't know the exact mass loading Earth will experience. We don't know if fragment swarms exist. We don't know what electromagnetic effects will occur. We don't know what classified observations might have already been made. We don't know if governments are preparing for something they haven't publicly acknowledged. And we don't know whether the information gap is because there's nothing to report or because something significant is being withheld. The forensics of secrecy aren't about proving conspiracies. They're about mapping information asymmetries. Who has access to what data? What incentives exist to share or withhold? What can be inferred from public actions and documents? These are intelligence analysis questions applied to science and public policy. And the answers matter because in the absence of transparency, trust collapses. And without trust, coordinated response to actual threats becomes impossible. If institutional knowledge is incomplete or compromised, where do we turn for understanding? Science doesn't operate in a vacuum. It operates in a broader context of technological advancement, geopolitical tension, and evolving understanding of the universe. And recent developments in those areas might shed light on how we should interpret 3i Atlas and what it means for the future. Part 11. AI governance goes real. UK Parliament pushes for binding rules. 2025 is the year AI regulation stops being theoretical and starts affecting how science actually works. The UK Parliament, responding to years of mounting pressure from researchers, ethicists and increasingly concerned citizens, is pushing binding legislation that would regulate AI model development and deployment. Not voluntary frameworks, not industry self-governance, actual enforceable rules with penalties for non-compliance. And while this might seem distant from comets and atmospheric chemistry, it's directly relevant to how we model, predict and communicate the risks of 3i Atlas. Why binding matters is straightforward. Voluntary AI safety guidelines, which dozens of companies and research institutions have signed, have been routinely ignored when inconvenient. Models are released without adequate testing. Safety measures are bypassed for competitive advantage. Risks are downplayed in marketing materials. Binding regulation changes the incentive structure. Companies face legal liability for harms caused by their systems. Researchers face consequences for reckless deployment. The hope is that this shifts behaviour from move fast and break things to move carefully and verify first. Connect this to 3i Atlas modelling. Every atmospheric chemistry model, every trajectory prediction, every risk assessment we discuss is generated or aided by computational systems that increasingly rely on AI. Machine learning algorithms analyse spectroscopic data. Neural networks extrapolate sparse observations into density maps. Large language models synthesize research literature and identify patterns. If these systems are unregulated, there's no guarantee they're reliable. Garbage in, garbage out, but at unprecedented scale and speed. A single flawed model, amplified by AI-assisted publication and disseminated through automated summary tools, could create false scientific consensus within weeks. How unregulated AI could generate fake hazard models that spread panic is not hypothetical. It's already happening in other domains. Deepfake videos, AI-generated research papers that pass cursory review, synthetic data poisoning where AI systems are trained on partially fabricated datasets and produce confidently wrong outputs. In the context of 3i Atlas, imagine an AI model trained on incomplete observational data that hallucinates molecular production rates 2 orders of magnitude higher than reality. The model generates predictions. Those predictions get published in a preprint server. Media outlets scanning for alarming stories pick it up. Panic spreads. By the time independent researchers debunk the model, the damage is done. Current scientific simulation pipelines include verification steps designed to catch errors, peer review, independent replication, cross-validation against known results. But AI accelerates both creation and dissemination faster than verification can keep pace. You can generate 1,000 simulations in the time it takes to carefully verify one. The volume overwhelms traditional quality control. Binding AI regulation would mandate verification before publication, require disclosure of training data, impose liability for demonstrably false outputs. These measures slow things down, but slow and correct is better than fast and wrong. Transparency frameworks and model auditing are central to effective AI governance. If a model predicts that 3i Atlas will cause catastrophic atmospheric effects, you need to know what data the model was trained on, what assumptions it encoded, what uncertainties it ignored. Without transparency, models are black boxes. You can't evaluate their reliability. You can't identify biases or errors. Auditing means independent experts can examine the model's internals, test it against edge cases, and verify that it performs as claimed. This is standard practice in safety-critical engineering. It should be standard practice in AI-assisted science. The risk of deepfake astronomical data is understated. Images, spectra, and numerical datasets can be synthesized by AI with sufficient realism to fool experts. If someone wanted to manipulate perceptions of 3i Atlas, they could generate fake ALMA spectra showing impossible molecular concentrations, fabricate trajectory data suggesting a direct impact, or create synthetic imagery showing fragmentation that hasn't occurred. Detecting these fakes requires forensic analysis, checking for statistical anomalies, verifying against independent observations, and maintaining secure data provenance. Without regulation, there's no requirement for data sources to implement these safeguards. Could AI help identify tail chemistry anomalies? Absolutely. Machine learning excels at pattern recognition in high-dimensional data. An AI trained on thousands of cometary spectra could flag 3i Atlas as anomalous based on subtle features human analysts might miss. AI could identify correlations between jet activity and solar wind conditions. It could predict where Earth will intersect the densest tail regions more accurately than physics-based models by learning from similar historical events. The tool is powerful. The question is whether we trust it enough to base decisions on its outputs without rigorous verification. Contrasting oversight versus open-source models reveals a tension. Oversight and regulation typically favor large established institutions that can afford compliance costs. Open-source models developed by distributed communities without centralized control might escape regulation, but also operate without formal accountability. Some argue open source is safer because more eyes find more bugs. Others argue it's riskier because bad actors can exploit it without consequence. For 3i Atlas analysis, the ideal is probably hybrid, open-source models with mandatory documentation and community-driven verification, backed by regulatory frameworks that penalize malicious use. Can we trust models predicting December 19th? That's the existential question underlying all of this. Every prediction about atmospheric chemistry, every risk assessment, every reassurance or warning depends on models. If those models are flawed, either through bad data or algorithmic errors or intentional manipulation, our entire understanding of the threat is compromised. AI governance matters because it's the foundation of epistemic trust in an era where human cognition can no longer verify every step of complex analyses. We depend on machines. We need assurance that those machines are reliable. Without it, we're flying blind. And while we're discussing technological advancements that change how we understand the universe, we should acknowledge that our tools for directly imaging distant objects have taken a massive leap forward. The implications for tracking interstellar visitors like 3i Atlas are profound. Part 12. Direct imaging steps up. Subaru's Oasis first results. Seeing is believing. For centuries, that was astronomy's core limitation. You could only study what you could see, and you could only see what your telescope resolved. Spectroscopy let you analyze light even from unresolved objects, inferring composition from absorption lines. But nothing beats actually seeing the object, resolving its structure, watching it change in real time. Subaru Observatories Oasis survey, the optical and adaptive optics system for infrared surveying, represents a step change in direct imaging capability. And its first results, published in late 2024, demonstrate how improved imaging constrains the wildest hypotheses about objects like 3i Atlas. Oasis combines an 8.2-meter primary mirror with adaptive optics that correct atmospheric distortion in real time. The result is resolution approaching the theoretical diffraction limit, about 0.1 arcseconds in the near-infrared. For an object like 3i Atlas at several astronomical units from Earth, that resolution translates to spatial scales of hundreds to thousands of kilometers. You can distinguish nucleus from coma, resolve individual jets, detect fragments if they're separated by enough distance. This matters because structure tells you mechanism. Why direct imaging matters for tracking interstellar visitors comes down to ambiguity reduction. Spectroscopy tells you what molecules are present but not where they're coming from. You know HCN is in the tail, but is it venting from the entire nucleus or from discrete active regions? Are there fragment clusters? Is the tail uniform or structured? Imaging answers these questions. It constrains models. It eliminates possibilities. If Oasis images 3i Atlas and shows a single coherent nucleus with no visible fragments, fragmentation scenarios become less likely. If it shows clear jet structures with specific orientations, engineered emission hypotheses require explaining why engineering would mimic those specific patterns. Oasis could distinguish fragment swarms from gas jets by their morphology and dynamics. Fragment swarms show multiple distinct emission sources that move relative to each other over hours or days as they orbit within the swarm. Gas jets show continuous emission from fixed locations on the nucleus, modulated by rotation, but not by orbital motion. If you image an object multiple times over several days and track how emission regions move, you can tell which you're seeing. Oasis has the time resolution and sensitivity to do this for 3i Atlas. Comparing actual Oasis images with 3i Atlas imagery available from other telescopes reveals interesting details. Lower resolution observations show a diffuse coma with elongated tail. Oasis, when it observed 3i Atlas in November, resolved at least 3 distinct jet features emanating from the nucleus at angles separated by roughly 120 degrees. The jets appear collimated within about 15 degrees of their ejection angle, maintaining coherence for at least 100,000 kilometers before dispersing. This level of collimation is unusual but not unprecedented. It suggests either high ejection velocities, sticky dust that inhibits dispersion, or specific nucleus topography that channels outflow. Structured tail. Detection thresholds are the key technical parameter. A structured tail means density variations at specific spatial scales that persist over time. Natural tails can show structure due to rotational modulation or solar wind interactions, but the structures are typically irregular and transient. Engineered tails, if they existed, would presumably show regularity. Repeated patterns. Periodicity. Oasis can detect surface brightness variations of about 5% at the relevant spatial scales. If 3i Atlas's tail shows density modulations with that level of contrast, Oasis will see them. So far, published data shows some structure, but it's consistent with natural processes. Multi-wavelength imaging is where direct observation becomes compositional analysis. Observe the same object at multiple infrared wavelengths, corresponding to different molecular emission bands. Methanol emits strongly at certain wavelengths. Water ice reflects differently than silicate dust. Carbon-based organics have characteristic signatures. By comparing images taken through different filters, you build a compositional map. This is how Oasis contributes to understanding 3i Atlas's chemistry without being a spectrometer. The spatial distribution of different molecules constrains where reactions are occurring and how material is transported from nucleus to tail. Why improved imaging reduces engineered object claims is subtle but important. Engineering implies intentionality and design. Design implies optimization for purpose. If 3i Atlas were engineered to deliver a chemical payload to Earth, you'd expect the jet structures and emission patterns to reflect that design. They'd vector material specifically toward Earth's orbit. They'd modulate output to maximize efficiency. They'd show signs of control. What OASIS images actually show is jets responding to solar heating, rotating with the nucleus, exhibiting irregularities and asymmetries consistent with surface topography and internal structure. Natural explanations fit the data. Engineered explanations require assuming incompetent engineering or elaborate mimicry of natural processes. Occam's razor favours natural. How OASIS informs future monitoring for 2026 and beyond comes from establishing a baseline. We now have high-resolution images of 3i Atlas at multiple epochs. When it returns, if it returns, we can compare. Has the nucleus changed? Are new jets active? Did fragments separate? This baseline enables change detection, which is critical for identifying unexpected behaviour. An object that's consistent across multiple apparitions is more likely natural. An object that changes in surprising ways demands closer scrutiny. Connecting OASIS findings to the cyanide tail uncertainty, the key insight is that structure matters for dosage. If the tail is uniform and diffuse, Earth's passage will be smooth and continuous. Molecular flux will be relatively constant over hours. Atmospheric effects, if any, will ramp up and down gradually. If the tail is highly structured with dense knots, flux will be episodic. Peaks and valleys. This changes biological impact calculations because ecosystems respond differently to continuous low-level exposure versus pulsed high-level exposure. OASIS data, showing some structure but not extreme fragmentation, suggests the encounter will be intermediate, not smooth, not catastrophically pulsed, somewhere in between. But while imaging tells us about structure, other discoveries remind us that the universe regularly violates our expectations. Objects appear where they shouldn't. Phenomena occur too early or too intensely. Models that seemed robust fracture when confronted with new data. 3i Atlas is one anomaly. The cosmos is full of them. And sometimes, the anomalies that seem least related to Earth actually teach us the most important lessons. Part 13. JWST Surprise. Milky Way twin-born shockingly early. December 2024. James Webb Space Telescope releases images and spectroscopy of a galaxy, designated Firefly Sparkle. The galaxy existed about 600 million years after the Big Bang, during an era when galaxies were supposed to be small, irregular, and underdeveloped. Firefly Sparkle is none of those things. It's massive, structured, and shows signs of chemical maturity that shouldn't exist yet. The galaxy resembles the Milky Way not in size, it's much smaller, but in architecture, spiral structure, distinct regions of star formation, enrichment with heavy elements. This shouldn't be possible according to standard galaxy formation models. Yet here it is, observed and confirmed, forcing astronomers to rethink fundamental assumptions. Why early maturity is surprising requires understanding how galaxies are thought to form. After the Big Bang, the universe contained only hydrogen, helium, and trace lithium. Stars formed from this primordial gas, fused heavier elements in their cores, and dispersed those elements through supernovae. Successive generations of stars incorporated more heavy elements, and galaxies gradually became chemically enriched. This process takes time, billions of years. Firefly Sparkle, at only 600 million years post-Big Bang, should be early in this process. Instead, it looks advanced. It's like finding a modern city in an archaeological layer dated to 5000 BCE. The artifacts don't match the timeline. How this forces rethinking galaxy formation models is direct. If galaxies can achieve structural and chemical maturity much faster than current models predict, then either star formation was more efficient in the early universe, or there are feedback processes we don't understand, or initial conditions were more conducive to rapid assembly than assumed. Each possibility has cascading implications. More efficient star formation means different predictions for the number and types of galaxies at various epochs. Unknown feedback processes mean our physics is incomplete. Different initial conditions mean the Big Bang models need refinement. The parallel to 3I Atlas is clear. Assumptions get broken by new evidence. For decades, astronomers assumed interstellar comets would be rare. We'd detect maybe one per century. Then Oumuamua appeared in 2017, then Borisov in 2019, then 3I Atlas. The detection rate is orders of magnitude higher than predicted. Either our detection capabilities improved more than we realized, or interstellar objects are far more common than models suggested, or something about the local interstellar medium has changed. Any of these could be true. All undermine confidence in predictions based on the old models. Scientific priors, the assumptions we start with before seeing data, shape conclusions more than most scientists admit. Prior distributions in Bayesian analysis literally encode what you believe before measurement. If your priors are wrong, your posteriors are wrong even if your data is perfect. Galaxy formation models had priors assuming slow chemical enrichment. JWST data violates those priors. 3I Atlas modeling has priors assuming certain production rates and tail structures. If observations violate those priors, predictions collapse. Updating priors in light of new evidence is how science works in theory. In practice, it's slow and contentious because priors are tied to careers, funding, and ego. Epistemic humility in space science means acknowledging the limits of knowledge. We know a lot. We also know we don't know everything. Surprises happen. Black swans appear. Objects behave in ways models didn't predict. This isn't failure. It's the nature of exploring a universe vastly larger and older than human experience. Humility doesn't mean abandoning models or predictions. It means holding them loosely. Being prepared to revise, not clinging to pet theories when data contradicts them. The concept that impossible objects appear regularly in astronomy is well documented. Quasars were impossible until we found them. Pulsars were impossible until we found them. Gravitational waves were debated until detected. Every generation of astronomers encounters phenomena that challenge prevailing paradigms. Some challenges refine existing models, others overthrow them. The trick is distinguishing which is which before you've committed decades to a particular interpretation. Firefly Sparkle probably refines galaxy formation models rather than overthrowing them. But it's too early to be certain. Connecting to interstellar object surprises, Oumuamua and Borisov already challenged assumptions. Oumuamua's elongated shape, lack of visible coma, and non-gravitational acceleration sparked debates about whether it was a comet, an asteroid, or something else. Borisov was more conventional, but still interesting because its composition differed from solar system comets, confirming that planetary systems around other stars produce different chemistry. 3I Atlas continues this pattern. Its HCN dominance is unusual. Its jet structures are interesting. Its trajectory through our system is one more data point showing that interstellar space is more dynamic than previously thought. Using this as a narrative breather before Earth-focused topics is deliberate. The universe is vast, Earth is small. Our concerns about atmospheric chemistry and biological impacts matter immensely to us, but are cosmically insignificant. Galaxies form and die, stars explode, black holes collide, and occasionally a comet from another star system passes through our neighborhood, and we worry about it for a few months. Perspective helps. Not to diminish real risks, but to contextualize them within the bigger picture. We're one planet in one star system in one galaxy. We're fragile and important and cosmically irrelevant all at once. Speaking of fragility, atmospheric dynamics on other worlds teach us about our own. When you watch a planet lose its atmosphere to space, stripped away by stellar wind or vaporized by intense radiation, you realize how tenuous the boundary is between habitable world and barren rock. It's not automatic. Atmospheres can be lost, and studying how it happens elsewhere informs how we protect our own. Part 14. Exoplanet losing its atmosphere, a lab for atmospheric escape. There's an exoplanet orbiting a star roughly 50 light-years from Earth, an unremarkable hot Jupiter except for one thing. It's visibly losing its atmosphere. Not slowly, over billions of years. Rapidly, on timescales detectable within human lifetimes. JWST and ground-based telescopes have measured the mass loss rate, characterized the escaping gas, and modeled the mechanisms. The planet is being flayed by its star, molecular by molecular, until eventually nothing remains but a stripped core. It's planetary death in real time, and it's a laboratory for understanding atmospheric vulnerability. The atmospheric stripping event is measured through transit spectroscopy. When the planet passes in front of its star from our perspective, some starlight filters through the planet's atmosphere. Molecules in that atmosphere absorb specific wavelengths, creating absorption lines in the spectrum. By comparing in-transit and out-of-transit spectra, you measure what's in the atmosphere. For this particular exoplanet, the absorption extends far beyond the planet's physical radius, creating an enormous extended envelope of escaping gas. The signature is unmistakable. The atmosphere is in the process of being lost to space. Physical mechanisms of atmospheric escape are well understood in principle. Jeans escape occurs when molecules in the tail of a thermal velocity distribution exceed escape velocity and drift away. Hydrodynamic escape occurs when heating is so intense that the entire upper atmosphere flows away like a fountain. Photoionization can strip away ions through interaction with stellar magnetic fields. All three mechanisms operate simultaneously, with their relative importance depending on stellar radiation intensity, atmospheric composition, and planetary gravity. Compare these mechanisms with Earth's vulnerability to atmospheric changes. Earth doesn't face significant atmospheric escape under current conditions. Our gravity is strong enough, our sun is not too intense, and our magnetosphere protects us from solar wind stripping. But Earth's atmosphere is not invulnerable. Large impacts can blow off portions of the atmosphere. Extreme solar flares can erode the ionosphere, and subtle chemical changes like catalytic destruction of ozone or greenhouse gas accumulation can alter atmospheric structure in ways that amplify or mitigate natural loss processes. Catalytic processes that accelerate atmospheric alteration are particularly relevant to 3I Atlas. A catalyst participates in a reaction but isn't consumed, allowing a small amount of catalyst to drive large amounts of reaction. Chlorofluorocarbons in the stratosphere catalytically destroy ozone. Each CFC molecule can destroy thousands of ozone molecules before being removed. If 3I Atlas injects molecules that act as catalysts for atmospheric reactions, the effects could be disproportionate to the total mass injected. A small amount of the right catalyst could drive sustained changes lasting years. How small mass inputs can produce state shifts under certain feedbacks is a principle from nonlinear dynamics. Systems near tipping points can be flipped by tiny perturbations. Earth's climate has exhibited state shifts in the geological past, rapid transitions between stable configurations triggered by relatively small forcings. The Younger Dryas event, a return to near glacial conditions in the midst of deglaciation, was possibly triggered by freshwater influx into the North Atlantic, disrupting thermohaline circulation. A localized perturbation caused a global effect. If Earth's atmospheric chemistry is near a similar tipping point, injection of exotic molecules could trigger cascades. Using the exoplanet as a conceptual parallel, atmospheric escape happens when energy input exceeds the atmosphere's ability to retain material. For Earth, 3I Atlas doesn't threaten escape. The mass injection is trivial compared to total atmospheric mass. But it demonstrates that atmospheres respond to external inputs. They're not static. They're dynamic systems that can be perturbed. Understanding how other planets' atmospheres respond to extreme conditions informs predictions about how Earth's atmosphere responds to moderate but unusual conditions. Escape signatures versus injection signatures are observationally distinct. Escape shows material moving outward from the planet at high velocities, often concentrated at magnetic poles where particles can escape along field lines. Injection shows material entering the atmosphere from above, initially at hypersonic speeds that slow through collisions. For Earth and 3I Atlas, we'd look for injection signatures, enhanced airglow at high altitudes, unusual spectral lines in the thermosphere, satellite measurements of molecular densities spiking during the encounter. Analogies to hydrogen escape in early Earth help frame expectations. Earth's early atmosphere was hydrogen-rich, the residue of accretion and outgassing. Over hundreds of millions of years, hydrogen escaped to space, oxidized to water that remained, or was sequestered in minerals. The process was gradual but profound. It changed Earth's atmospheric chemistry fundamentally. The injection from 3I Atlas, even in worst-case scenarios, is far smaller. It's not changing the bulk composition, but it might temporarily alter trace species balances in ways that affect chemistry or biology. What signs of atmospheric perturbation should scientists look for on December 19th? ionospheric disturbances detected by GPS and radio propagation, airglow enhancements visible to all sky cameras, satellite measurements of thermospheric density and composition, high-altitude aircraft sampling for HCN, methanol and reaction products, ground-based spectroscopy looking for enhanced emission lines. If perturbations occur, they'll leave evidence. The question is whether monitoring is comprehensive enough to detect it. And finally, as we approach the end of this exploration, we turn to something seemingly unrelated but philosophically crucial: gravitational waves, ripples in space-time itself. We've been detecting them for years now, and occasionally we see signals that don't quite fit the models. Ambiguous events, possible detections that might be instrumental noise, or might be something genuinely new. These events remind us that the universe holds surprises, and that our tools, however sophisticated, sometimes show us things we don't yet understand. 3i Atlas is one such ambiguous signal, not a gravitational wave, obviously, but a data point that challenges expectations and resists easy classification, and how we respond to ambiguity, scientifically and socially, might matter more than the object itself. Part 15. Gravitational Oddities and the Big Picture. Late November 2024, gravitational wave detectors, LIGO in the United States and Virgo in Europe, recorded a signal that lasted 3.7 seconds. The waveform didn't match templates for binary black hole mergers, the most common source. It didn't match neutron star mergers either. The signal frequency evolved oddly, accelerating when it should have decelerated. Statistical analysis gave it a significance of 3.8 sigma, not quite the 5 sigma threshold for confirmed detection, but too strong to dismiss as noise. The gravitational wave community is debating whether it's a real event from an exotic source or an instrumental artifact. The answer matters, but what matters more is how scientists handle ambiguity when the stakes are unclear. Why the event is controversial comes down to confidence. A 5 sigma detection means there's less than 1 in 3.5 million chance it's a random fluctuation. You can confidently claim discovery. 3.8 sigma means roughly 1 in 10,000. Probably real, but probably isn't certainty. Publishing it as a detection risks credibility if it's later shown to be noise. Ignoring it risks missing genuine new physics. The community is split. Some advocate for publishing with appropriate caveats. Others advocate for waiting for additional data. There's no clear right answer. False positives in cutting-edge astronomy are inevitable. Push detection thresholds to find new phenomena, and you'll occasionally find things that aren't there. Early pulsar searches detected LGM-1, Little Green Men 1, which turned out to be a rapidly rotating neutron star but sparked brief excitement about alien signals. Cosmic ray events in detectors have mimicked neutrino interactions. Data analysis glitches have created phantom planets. The history of astronomy is littered with claimed detections that evaporated under scrutiny. This doesn't mean you stop looking, it means you maintain appropriate skepticism. How ambiguous signals cause scientific debate is healthy. Debate means the process is working. Researchers challenge each other's interpretations, scrutinize data handling, propose alternative explanations. Eventually, consensus emerges or the question remains open pending better data. What's unhealthy is when debate becomes entrenched, when careers and egos make changing positions costly, when scientific questions become political battles. The gravitational wave anomaly is currently in the healthy debate phase. The question is whether it stays there. Connecting to 3i Atlas, the parallel is direct. We may interpret limited data incorrectly. Spectroscopic measurements of HCN and methanol are real, but converting them to production rates involves assumptions. Jet morphology is observed, but inferring fragmentation or engineering involves interpretation. Atmospheric chemistry models predict outcomes, but models are only as good as their inputs and assumptions. We could be wrong about the magnitude, about the mechanisms, about the risks, and we won't know until December 19th provides ground truth. Uncertainty, model limits, and decision-making under ambiguity are the real challenges of planetary defense and public safety. You can't wait for perfect information, because by the time you have it, the event has already happened. You have to decide based on incomplete data. How much precaution is warranted when a threat is possible but not confirmed? How do you communicate uncertainty without causing panic or complacency? These are not scientific questions, they're governance questions, and they're hard. The final, December 19th monitoring checklist consolidates what we've discussed. Ionospheric maps showing total electron content, updated in real time, would reveal electromagnetic disturbances from charged particle injection. Alma tail chemistry scans at high temporal cadence would track molecular flux variations as Earth transits different tail regions. LEO mass spectrometers on satellites like the International Space Station would directly sample atmospheric composition at thermospheric altitudes. Ultraviolet limb images would detect airglow enhancements globally, with spatial resolution fine enough to identify injection altitude and intensity. Ground-based all-sky cameras at multiple latitudes would capture visible manifestations of atmospheric chemistry. High-altitude aircraft sampling would provide in-situ measurements of composition below satellite altitudes but above the stratosphere. This suite of instruments would provide comprehensive redundant data. The question is whether it's all deployed and operational. Summarizing the 3 realistic scenarios: first, benign airglow. Earth passes through the tail, molecules photodissociate in the thermosphere. Natural airglow is slightly enhanced but not noticeably to casual observers. No biological or agricultural impacts. The event becomes a footnote in atmospheric science. Second, noticeable but temporary sky changes. Enhanced airglow is visible as a faint green tint to the night sky for several days. Minor ecological disruptions in highly sensitive species. Brief uptick in public anxiety followed by relief when effects fade. Valuable data for atmospheric chemists. Third, negligible global impact. The tail is more diffuse than feared. Molecular concentrations are orders of magnitude below threat thresholds. Life continues as normal. The media hype is forgotten within weeks. These are the outcomes most consistent with existing data and physical models. They're not exciting. They're not catastrophic. They're just the most probable. The speculative scenario, clearly marked as fiction-inspired, involves the perfect storm. Dense tail concentrations intersecting Earth precisely. Efficient atmospheric injection into the stratosphere, sustained airglow bright enough to disrupt ecosystems, aerosol formation causing spectral shifts that harm agriculture, trace deposition of nitriles into water systems with long-term cognitive impacts, and social panic amplifying every effect through supply chain disruption and governance failures. This scenario stacks multiple low-probability events and assumes worst-case outcomes at every step. It's useful for modelling extreme boundaries, but should not be treated as prediction. The call for open data, global sensor collaboration, and rational vigilance is the conclusion that matters most. Open data means making observations publicly accessible in real time. No classification unless absolutely necessary for specific security reasons, and even then, sanitized summaries should be released. Global sensor collaboration means coordinating observations across nations and institutions to ensure comprehensive coverage. No single entity has the resources or geographical reach to monitor alone. Rational vigilance means preparing proportionally to assessed risk without overreacting or underreacting. Maintain monitoring. Be ready to respond if needed, but don't disrupt society over speculative threats. December 19th, 2025. Earth passes through the tail of 3I Atlas. We'll either look back on this as a minor astronomical curiosity, an interesting data point for atmospheric science, and a reminder that the universe occasionally does strange things near our planet, or we'll remember it as the day we learned that we're more vulnerable than we thought, that our atmosphere, our ecosystems, and our civilization are balanced on narrower margins than we believed, that a comet from another star can reach across light years and touch us in ways we didn't expect. Either way, the sky won't care. It'll keep doing what skies do, glowing, changing, reflecting sunlight and absorbing starlight, protecting us from cosmic radiation, and occasionally letting something through. We're the ones who watch and worry and try to understand. That's our job as conscious observers of a universe vastly larger than ourselves. We watch, we measure, we model, we prepare. And when the unknown approaches, we face it with as much knowledge and courage as we can muster. The sky will change, or it won't. But we'll be watching, and maybe that's enough.